Welcome, everyone. I'm Rajesh, joining you from Canberra. To begin, I acknowledge the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend this respect to all traditional owners of the lands, wherever you all live and work today. A brief introduction to our platform, the Consortium for Research on Innovation Studies, also known as CRIS. Started in 2021 by early career researchers, CRIS began with a lecture series on innovation systems to commemorate Christopher Freeman's birth centenary. Due to popular demand, we continued beyond the centenary year, offering several series to benefit early career innovation researchers, especially from the Global South. The In Conversation series records intellectual biographies of key innovation scholars. Sadly, we recently lost two members of our community, Richard Nelson and Edward Lawrence. Both Dick and Ned were great supporters and enthusiastic participants of our activities. Let's observe a moment of silence in their memory. Today, in our 19th conversation, Roy Green will be interviewed by Julie Hare. We have Elizabeth Webster, Tim Kastelle, and Danielle Logue as panelists. Julie Hare is the education editor at the Australian Financial Review. She has written on education for over 25 years, including a 7-year stint as the higher education editor of the daily The Australian. She was honored with the award of Higher Education Journalist of the Year 2023. Elizabeth Webster is the director of the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economics and Social Research at the University of Melbourne. With a PhD from Cambridge and degrees from Monash University, she is an expert in the economics of knowledge creation and diffusion. She has authored over 150 articles and served on several prestigious committees and was honored as the 2022 Distinguished Fellow of the Economic Society of Australia. Tim Kastelle is Professor and Director of the Andrew N. Liveris Academy for Innovation and Leadership at the University of Queensland. With degrees from Princeton and UQ, his work focuses on innovation management. He has extensive industry experience and has published widely in leading innovation journals. Danielle Logue is Professor of Innovation and Impact at the University of New South Wales Business School and Director of the UNSW Centre for Social Impact. With over 20 years of experience in social innovation, she is a global leader in social impact research. With this, I'll hand over to Julie, who will moderate the rest of the program. She will also introduce Roy and engage in a 40-minute conversation with him. Subsequently, Beth, Tim, and Daniel will ask a few questions, and we conclude with an open question and answer session. Audience, please post your well-framed questions in the chat box as they arise. We will pick them up and let you ask them yourself. Considering the time limitations, please be brief and to the point. Please also keep your microphones on mute when you do not need to speak. We are recording this program and also live streaming on YouTube. The recording will be made available on our website. Enjoy the conversation. Thank you. Over to you, Julie.
Thanks, Rajesh, and thank you and welcome everybody. It's my absolute delight to introduce Professor Roy Green. His CV is so long that it would take pretty well the entire session to get through it, so we're going to annotate it very briefly to begin with, and we'll discuss it in more length as we go along. Roy's current title is Special Innovation Advisor at University of Technology, Sydney. He tells me in his own words that he's on a few boards and advises people who don't listen to him. But more specifically, he's on the boards of the CSIRO, which is, if you don't know, Australia's largest and premier government-based research organisation. He's on the board of the Port of Newcastle, which we will discuss. He's on the board of the SmartSat CRC, which I think he's probably going to have to explain to us, as well as Advanced Robotics for Manufacturing Hub. Before all of this work on boards, he has been a Dean of Business at University of Technology, Sydney, and before that Macquarie, and before that at the University of Galway. He's advised politicians and business people alike. And I was thinking about this today, and I don't know when I actually first met Roy. We seem to have been in each other's orbit for years and years and years, and I can't remember a time when he wasn't actually there. But he's always been an active participant in the academic and social travails of innovation, and a very verbal participant in the conversations that take place. He seems to be every man, everywhere, all the time, and here he is today. So thank you. Welcome, Roy.
Thank you, Julie. Great to be here.
Well, I just, I've got a little bit of research on you, on your backstory, but I always like to go right back to the very beginning. So, Roy, I think families are interesting and where you come from. And do you just want to tell us a little bit about, where you were born, who your parents were, and what your ambition was as a 10-year-old, what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Wow, that's going to be a complicated story. Just before I do, I'd also like to acknowledge Richard Nelson, and a person to whom we all look up to in this area, who passed away in the last couple of weeks. So a very sad thing, but Richard, as Rajesh has pointed out, started this whole program together with Rajesh, who's been the coordinator. So that gives me a bit more time to think about where I came from. And I guess I'm one of Australia's many immigrants, but I emigrated here when I was about 6 weeks old. My mother was German Jewish refugee who found her way to Edinburgh as an au pair girl for the famous Max Born family. Max Born being a famous Jewish emigre scientist, friend of Einstein. And she was wanting to learn English. And in her diary, she's no longer with us, of course, but in her diary, which I've had a look at around the time I was born, or at least a little bit later, she noted that Max Born had taken a new PhD student, Herbert Green, my father. And she said, his name is Herbert Green. He seems very nice. Then a few weeks later, she writes in her diary, Dr. Green has asked me to go for a walk. And then a few weeks later, we're going camping. And that's when I trace back over the months to my conception. We were to be based ultimately in Princeton because Max Born recommended my father, who was a mathematical physicist, to Einstein as his most brilliant student. This is all in the Max Born Einstein letters. But when he got there, he realized that the McCarthy period was underway. And indeed, many of his colleagues were being put under house arrest because they were associated with Max Born. And Max Born, in turn, was associated with Klaus Fuchs, who gave the nuclear secrets to the Russians, something covered in the Oppenheimer film recently. And my father thought that wasn't a good place to emigrate to at that point in his career. with my mother, whom he was about to marry, and they got married in Ireland because there was a branch of the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies in Dublin. And so he made his first steps in his academic career there with interesting people like Schrödinger. This was an institution set up by the then president of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, who happened to be a mathematician and took a great interest in the work of that institute. So I was born in Dublin. That's the story. And within 6 weeks, we were on our way to Australia because my father had been offered the Foundation Professor of Mathematical Physics at the University of Adelaide by an enterprising Vice-Chancellor trying to set up some of his new faculties. And my mother wasn't very keen on this, but my father insisted that it would only be for 3 years and then things would blow over in Princeton and they would go back there. Of course, they never did. And hence my upbringing was in Adelaide, a sleepy place until it was livened up by a very progressive premier that everyone in Australia will recall, namely Don Dunstan, who impressed on us when I went to university. I'll skip the period when I was 10, I think. Thanks, Julie. I don't think there was much to report at that point. But when I was at university, Don Dunstan used to come down and give us a talk every now and again on his vision of the future. And we were all pretty radical and thought, you know, what's he got to tell us? But he did make a point at one of his lectures there of his idea of utopia, as he put it. And it stuck with me throughout my life, right up till now. He said, my vision of utopia, and this is what I want to create in South Australia, is Singapore for industrialization, Sweden for social democracy, and Italy for lifestyle. Now, who could disagree with that? And of course, he paved the way for the Whitlam era and a lot of the big changes that occurred in Australia's economy and society around that time after a long period of conservative rule. So I was at university and wondering what on earth I would do. My parents were insisting I should do something that would be the basis of a career, and all I could think of was to do law, with absolutely no interest in becoming a lawyer. Along the way, I did a double degree. Funnily enough, in those days, and this is quite remarkable, if you wanted to do a double degree in the early 1970s in Australia, you had to get the personal permission of the Minister of Education. And so I had to write to the then Minister of Education, Malcolm Fraser, and he wrote back a very nice letter saying, I hereby give permission to you to do a double degree. Good luck with it. And I still have that letter. Quite remarkable. That was those were the days when universities were very small elite institutions, not as big sort of corporate machines as they are now. So it was quite charming in its own way, but obviously very inefficient for the government. And I did that degree and majored in economics, and that really caught my interest. That was the sweet spot for me, with a most remarkable economics faculty at the University of Adelaide at that time, led by the now late post-Keynesian economist Jeff Harcourt, but with a very stellar international group of professors and lecturers. And so that really set me up with an honours degree to get a studentship to Cambridge. And at Trinity College, I undertook an economics degree.
Can we just go back a step or two? I'm just
Sure.
wondering what it was about economics that spoke to you. I mean, you talk about inspirational teachers, Jeff Harcourt, and a very dynamic faculty at the time. But what was it that was really kind of, stinging to your imagination at the time?
It took me out of the very parochial environment of Adelaide to understand the rest of the world. How did the world
even John Dunstan's Adelaide, which was pretty exciting.
It was about as interesting as it could possibly get, although somewhat isolated. And what Jeff Harcourt's department was able to do was instill an interest in what was going on in the world economy generally, how the world ticked, what were the current debates in economic theory and in policy, what was motivating governments, how would we create prosperity into the future. This was the period of the Keynesian consensus, just coinciding, I guess, with the 1973 energy crisis when things came apart a bit. But it was a period of dramatic growth and general prosperity, or not entirely equally shared, but certainly more so than we find today. And what I was interested in was, what were these debates historically? How did we get to where we are as a society and an economy? And what would be the levers of change in the future? This also coincided with the resurgence of a more extreme version of market economics in the form of Milton Friedman's approach to inflation, which had taken off as part of the effect of the energy crisis. And rather than attribute this to obviously supply side factors, namely the energy crisis, he tried to pin it onto overexpansion of the money supply, hence the term monetarism. And this in turn was linked to the expansion of government spending. And so the political project that he had in mind was to reduce the role of the state, reduce the role of public spending, reduce trade union wage demands, and to return to a pre-Keynesian period when markets were the key self-regulating mechanism of our economies, and where in the orthodoxy, the way in which to analyze economies was with static equilibrium models. And this was something I wanted to take on in my PhD at Cambridge.
Can we just here, during this period, though, you also became politicised. You joined the Australian Labor Party. Now, from the sounds of your family, you're a family that, saw the world as something to be discussed around the dinner table. So politics wasn't something new to you. So what was it that kind of triggered the joining of the Labor Party, and did your parents approve?
This was the period of the Whitlam government, and we were all very excited by the changes that he brought about, the commitment to the growth of universities, free university education at that time, and the growth of social programs and infrastructure spending, something that we hadn't seen on that scale since just the end of the Second World War and the end of the White Australia policy. So it was a very interesting reconstruction of Labor's positioning away from protection, away from the White Australia policy, retaining some elements of what had happened in the past, namely the wage setting system, but that was to go later with Keating. It was a very fast-moving period when, of course, Whitlam also came unstuck with the world economic crisis, triggered by the energy crisis, of course, but also by other things, the severing of the American dollar from gold and so on. And then we had the constitutional crisis when the opposition blocked supply, and the Governor-General dismissed the Prime Minister, almost unprecedented. That's when I joined the Labor Party. I thought,
you and a lot of others, I imagine.
This is the moment. Have I subscribed to the Murdoch media since? No. 1975 was the last time I bought one of those newspapers.
Okay, so we'll move on a bit. So you finish your degree, you go traveling, and you're in the middle of somewhere in Europe, and you come across a letter that says you need to get yourself to Cambridge pretty quickly, right?
That's right. And in those days, without the internet, as you traveled around Europe, you got people to post you letters to a box called Post Restanti in whatever town you happened to be approaching, and you would pick up your letters as you went along on your trip. And at a particular point of that trip, I found a letter that had been sent 3 months earlier from Cambridge, which said, you are required to be in Cambridge to start your PhD in what turned out to be 2 or 3 weeks. And I was in the middle of Europe. So gathered up all my meager possessions in an old Volkswagen and drove straight over to Cambridge, only to find that the allocated supervisor, a very famous economist called Maurice Dobb, had just died 3 weeks earlier. And so I had to find another supervisor, which I did temporarily, and then ended up with a wonderful economic historian called Michael Poston. He was also the supervisor of Eric Hobsbawm and some other significant figures in our academic and political history. Now, he died as well, not too long after. And so finding a third supervisor was quite a challenge, given that the doors were closing on the corridor as I would walk along, looking for whoever might be prepared to take me on.
Two of
them had passed away. And my supervisor, who I ended up with, was Johnny Well, who was a wonderful supervisor. But in those days, PhDs are not like they are now, where you get prepared with research methods courses and you get assessments as you go, and people want to know exactly what point you've reached and get monitored and looked after. In those days, certainly in Cambridge, it was sink or swim. You were shown a massive theoretical tome by a famous economist. This is the PhD they did. Now you go and do one. And my PhD was entirely theoretical, called the Classical Theories of Money, Output and Inflation, just taking on this monetarism worldview and looking at it also in historical context. And so this is how I proceeded, but with significant help then at that point by my supervisor, Johnny, who was given a peerage, by the way, by the Kinnock government when it was finally elected. He became an advisor to the British Labour Party as well.
So how foundational was it for you to go to, to end up in somewhere like Cambridge after Adelaide? I mean, then, I'm not saying chalk and cheese, but we're pretty close.
Oh, it was, it was an extraordinary experience of a lifetime. And I spent about 10 years in Cambridge because I ran out of money with my scholarship and I had to get a job. And that extended the period of my PhD somewhat. But it was really brilliant, as you would imagine, with all the kind of people you could see in their lectures. My colleagues and I who were doing PhDs wouldn't just focus on what we were doing. We would spread our interests across the university and go to as many interesting lectures as we could find. And so it was really a very stimulating experience to be there. And some years later, I went back for a sabbatical and I was asked to give some lectures there in a course that where the lecturer had gone on sabbatical himself. And I thought, wow, now I'm part of the lecturing circuit in Cambridge. This is going to be amazing. And I went along to the economics building to my assigned lecture room. And outside, there was a huge queue of students waiting to get in. And I thought, wow, am I really that famous by now? Surely not. Well, of course, surely it wasn't, because there were two lecture halls next to each other. The other one said, lecture by Stephen J. Gould today. And when I went to my lecture room, there were a handful of 5 or 10 students bordering on sleepiness.
Oh, devastating. But
it
okay,
was a
so let's
stimulating
just talk
period.
about you. I am devastated for you, but okay. But you had to get a job, right, to support yourself, and this is kind of the beginning of working outside academia and starting to see the application of theory in real life. So this is just your
Exactly,
first
yeah.
toehold, yeah?
So there I was doing this very theoretical PhD, which I was determined to accomplish, and it became a book. And it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done and ever will do. But it was certainly worth doing. But I had to get a job as I went along. And the job that came up was to be an economic advisor to the British Labour Party at the time, that had just lost an election to Margaret Thatcher and was trying to rebuild itself, but was undergoing very fierce political debates. And so I got to know a lot of these interesting political figures in Britain at the time. And my job was at various times assigned to advising Tony Blair, who went on to greater things, and John Prescott, who became his deputy, among other lesser lights. But it was a time when I began to apply economics to what was going on in the world around me, and use the tools that I had assembled, but realized also the gaps that were needed to understand how to change a country's industrial structure, how to deal with the problems of growth and equality. And at the time, the British were going through the period of North Sea oil discovery. And it was a period not dissimilar from the one that we experienced in Australia with the commodity boom. In other words, there was massive windfall gains from these North Sea oil discoveries. And it was similar also to that which occurred in Holland in the early post-war period when they discovered North Sea gas. In other words, what is sometimes called the Dutch disease, where the currency is boosted by the terms of trade and the fact that these windfall gains would drive up your currency, thus making all your other industries less competitive, in particular in Britain's case, manufacturing, and also in our case. And they ended up with a country where quite a few more people were driving around in Porsches because it was a consumption boom, but public infrastructure and manufacturing were crumbling. Exactly what happened in Australia, and exactly what the Norwegians avoided with their 76% resource rent tax and a sovereign wealth fund. They understood how to keep the currency within boundaries, reasonable boundaries, and also how to make use of those windfall gains, not just to boost consumption, but to prepare for the future. And those are the sort of interesting issues that you confront when you start understanding the world through an innovation lens, and you start to look at the issues confronting countries' industrial structures, which is really what innovation theory and evolutionary economics is about. And
Did
which
you
contrasts
understand that did you understand that at the time, or is that something that you come back to with hindsight, the way the different countries dealt with what, their enormous wealth?
Yeah, I think at the time we all realized that all of these windfall gains were were being dissipated without any return, and that there was a political element, of course, as well, because the government was not interested in the future of manufacturing, and it also took on the miners at the time as well in the famous miners' strike. But it, I guess, occurred to me much later that all of these parallels existed between resource-rich countries and the different ways that they dealt with the challenges, the cards that they were dealt with, and that these outcomes were not ordained. They're not, if you leave it to the market, of course, that's the outcome you get. But if you intervene in the economy and you make decisions based on policy that lead to different outcomes, then that indicates to you that there may be some defects in the more orthodox economic theories. And when I mentioned earlier that these orthodox economic theories are about static equilibrium and markets that clear automatically, the contrast with that, and the contrast certainly in Northern Europe, and this is the case in Norway as well, is with a more Germanic tradition that led to works by Friedrich List in the 19th century, who wrote the book The National System of Political Economy, big contrast with the so-called marginalist revolution, or the market economics approach that was emerging in Britain and America. And then Joseph Schumpeter, of course, who also founded what we now call evolutionary economics, one that didn't base analysis on a static equilibrium model of resource allocation or allocative efficiency, but based it on a dynamic process of capital accumulation and growth.
Okay, so you came back to Australia at some point, and you again stayed with your feet in the world of politics, working for the Hawke government, correct?
Yes.
But this time you weren't in opposition. This time you were actually in government. What's the difference? What does it feel like?
Well, it felt very different. After a few years of being in opposition in Britain under Thatcherism, with the miserable weather and everything else, you think, get me out of here. And fortunately, there was a minister in the Australian government who was prepared to do that, namely Ralph Willis, who was one of the architects of the then Prices and Incomes Accord between the government and the trade unions. And he first employed me as the director of policy in his department, and then in his office as a senior advisor. So yes, what a transformation to go from opposition to government and to be able to genuinely pull some of those levers. It was a period, of course, that mirrored Thatcherism in some ways, with the liberalisation of the economy, opening up of the financial markets, and the tariff reductions. But what a lot of people overlook is the degree to which the Hawke-Keating governments had a strong interest also in industrial policy. And by this time, I had become very interested, almost one would say obsessed, with industrial policy and with the research and innovation agenda that could underpin it and be a source of transformation of an industrial structure based so heavily on resource exports and then fossil fuels as well, in the context of energy transition that came later. But this was an opportunity to use industry plans, to use structural adjustment measures, to use business improvement programs, workplace development programs. There was a huge range of programs to prepare the Australian economy for an open trading system, for competing in global markets and value chains, because everyone knew that traditional manufacturing, mass production systems would come under pressure from the decline of tariffs. And this coincided globally with the move from mass production systems, large vertically integrated companies, to smaller, more specialized companies. How would we create these smaller, more specialized companies if our low-cost competition companies could no longer compete because they were no longer low cost compared with the rest of the world? A lot of work went into creating these companies, supporting them, nurturing them. And by the end of the 1990s, it's often forgotten that elaborately transformed manufacturers, as they were called, was the fastest growing segment of our export mix. Then we had the commodity boom and it all came apart. But anyway, going back to your question, yes, going into government was incredible. And we did have the first white paper on science and technology in 1993. And then I was also involved, that came out of Treasury, believe it or not. But then there was a great process leading up to the Innovation White Paper, the Innovation Nation Statement by the then Industry Minister, Peter Cook, in 1995. If you read it now, you would think that was written yesterday because it sets out all the issues that we are currently confronting. But of course, 1 year later, 1996, they'd lost the election and Innovation Nation was on the shelf until
this happens in Australia a lot, doesn't it? That we have, I know we'll talk about this later, but it does happen that, 20, 30 years later, the papers that were put out then are still, relevant and today. Anyway, let's move forward. So you then was the Hawke Keating government still in power when you decided to jump back into academia? What did you want to do with academia with all this kind of really like hands-on policy experience?
Well, I went to Newcastle. My then wife was working there, and commuting between Canberra and Newcastle wasn't going to work once we had children. So I made the move to Newcastle, finished up in Canberra after 3 very interesting years. This is 1991. And I didn't have a job. Now, universities were a very different place. I hinted at that earlier, and they still were by that stage. I went to visit an old friend of mine, Barry Hughes, who was also an Adelaide economics lecturer at the time that I did my degree in Adelaide. And he was the head of the Department of Economics at the University of Newcastle. And I said, look, I'm here in Newcastle. I just wonder if you can give me some advice on what I need to do to find a job here, because I think it's probably time I came back into academia. He said, that's great timing. I need a senior lecturer. Can you start on Monday? I don't think that could happen these days. And so I then spent 8 or 9 very interesting years in Newcastle, which brought me very much into contact with industrial policy, manufacturing, regional development, including the closure of the steel industry, or the steel blast furnace, at the end of that decade. And I was quite heavily involved in that on behalf of the university, doing analysis of the skills that would be required in a more diversified regional economy. But by that stage, John Howard had been elected. Nothing was going on nationally in terms of the innovation agenda. There was a National Innovation Summit in Canberra, which turned out to be a damn squib. And by that stage, I'd also spent a sabbatical year in Ireland, where I became fascinated with how they had taken an economy with 17% unemployment and 20% inflation and turned it around in a 10 to 15 year period with industrial and innovation policy. They had just decided that they didn't want to be who they were. They wanted to be more like Singapore or Israel or Korea. They saw other small countries doing this, and they just put a great deal of effort into foreign direct investment attraction, bringing in knowledge-based foreign direct investors, especially digital and medical technology, then building up the indigenous SME sector with Enterprise Island, then creating Science Foundation Island to link universities to the investors and create value chains around the universities. It was just a remarkable experience to see. And so when I was asked to take over the role of a dean of the business school at National University of Ireland in Galway, I thought this would be a wonderful opportunity, and did it for 6 years. I was basically asked, could I turn a very traditional faculty into a modern business school? That's effectively what it was.
Kind of in the time frame that Ireland turned itself around. You invited Fintan O'Toole, the writer, to UTS at the end of last year, and he's written this amazing book on. It's an autobiography written through the lens of the history of Ireland from the late 50s onwards. But anyway, Ireland, I think, is just a perfect example of how innovation policy can actually turn around an economy that was on its knees. More than that. So we are running out of time. As I did say, you've got a very long and interesting CV. From Ireland, we're back to Australia. We're back at Macquarie Graduate School of Management, and then to UTS. So what was changing around business schools and thinking around innovation around this time? So we're in the post. Are we in the post-Howard years now?
So I came back 2006, and very fortuitously, I was invited by Steve Vamos, who was then the head of the BCA Innovation Task Force and head also of the Society for Knowledge Economics, to assist them with a paper that would be prepared by the BCA ahead of what was expected to be the 2007 election, on what would an innovation policy look like for Australia. Basically, the message was, you've been in Ireland for 6 years, tell us how it's done. And so that was a marvelous opportunity. And we came up with a paper called New Pathways to Prosperity, an Innovation Framework for Australia, which then got me into contact with Kim Carr, who read it and said, that's what we're going to do. And I spent once they were elected, spent the next 2 or 3 years with Kim Carr, helping him to implement this in the form of Enterprise Connect and all the innovation centres associated with that, set out in his recent political memoir, which is well worth a read, very racy. And of course, Powering Ideas, his 10-year plan for innovation, of which he only saw 2 of those years because of the switch from Prime Minister Rudd to Gillard. He was in the wrong faction, and so he lost his job. This was one of the great tragedies, I think, of the last 20 or 30 years, that we had a minister there who actually knew what he was doing, and he couldn't continue his job, and got passed to someone else who didn't understand it, and then went to the LNP government after that in 2013. We didn't really see anything further until Malcolm Turnbull with the National Innovation and Science Agenda. But in the meantime, yes, business schools started to play a role in this kind of development, both at the micro level, interested in organizational change and innovation at the level of the firm, and also influence on policy as well. While I guess Macquarie wasn't really so much in that game because it focused on producing MBA graduates, there was a limited opportunity there. It was really at UTS where we could develop this whole idea of a more interdisciplinary approach to the work of a business school and its impact on the wider society. So that was a very exciting time.
And yeah, a very exciting time. Now you just pulled me up. Now I think, Rajesh, are we right? Do you want to just finish up? So post UTS, the sort of work you're doing now, is this the sort of stuff you want to talk more with Beth and Tim and Daniel?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I finished as Dean at UTS in 2017. We'd by that stage got that new business school building built by Frank Geary.
Yeah.
It sort of exemplified where we wanted to be positioned. Danielle Logue, who's with us here, was our innovation professor, and it was a very interesting time for the business school to be able to imagine where it wanted to be in the future and then actually do it. But I had to stand down in 2017. I'd had my 2 terms, didn't want to do another one. And I thought, that's it for me at UTS. But the then Vice Chancellor, Attila Brungs, said, well, you can be my special innovation advisor. How would you like that? And I thought, well, that's an opportunity I wouldn't want to miss. And so he and then Andrew Parfitt, the current Vice Chancellor, were keen to keep me on 2 days a week, but it also gave me a lot of time to do other things. And the most important one, perhaps, of which was a kind of full circle back to Newcastle, because having been part of that steel transition and having not seen anything happen since then, what that was supposed to be was a container port. It was going to be, that land was to be remediated and turned into a large-scale container port. Never happened. Port was privatized. Long story around that, which I won't go to, but essentially the privatization arrangements prevented it from developing a container terminal in order to boost the sale price of Port Botany, very anti-competitive arrangement. And I was brought in by the shareholders to do something about that and to envisage what would this port look like post-coal. And so that's been an interesting experience to get rid of that restriction, bring in investors who are interested in developing a container terminal, and also developing an energy transition program, an economic diversification program. So that was terrific. I won't go into the others so much. CSIRO, we can talk about a bit later. The ARM Hub, Advanced Robotics for Manufacturing Hub, based in Queensland, is our attempt to do something like what they're doing in Ireland and in Germany with the Fraunhofers, in the UK with the catapult centres. In other words, to set up a facility external to universities, but involving universities, together with foreign direct investors and SME supply chains who want to develop research and technology as a key to their transformation and ultimate access to global markets. So that's an area of obvious interest, as is the SmartSat CRC. I've been involved in a few CRCs over the years, and SmartSat is about satellite and spatial technologies.
Okay, and I think it's time for a 5-minute break, and then when we reconvene, I'm handing over to the experts who are going to grill you about stuff that they know a lot about, and we'll see how much you actually know, Roy. So 5-minute break and then back, correct? Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
You ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, so this is where I hand over to Beth and Tim and Danielle. So how about we start with Beth?
Great. Thank you very much, Julie. Roy, I'm in absolute awe of your amazing career and all the variety and different things that you've done. If only all of us had gone through such an unusual career. Look, I'm really interested in some of your rather critical thoughts about the current state of teaching in economics and the way in which economics has gone from maybe where you were in the 1970s to where we are now. How do you see that playing out? And, somebody who is interested in the sort of real life issues and a more empirical approach backed by theory, what should we do?
Yeah, I think economics is in a pretty desperate state now. Ross Gittins had a go at this in his column a couple of weeks ago and was eviscerated by one of the defenders of the orthodox citadel, as you might expect. Essentially, we've moved away from any understanding of growth and accumulation to these static efficiency, allocative efficiency models that give primacy to markets which regulate themselves and which bias any participants in the modeling against government intervention, which is by definition a misallocation of resources and produces suboptimal outcomes. And so this is the mantra of all of our economic agencies and indeed economics courses which produce the graduates that run these agencies. In the Hawke-Keating period, even as recently as that, economics programs were very diverse. You started off in many such programs with the history of economic thought, believe it or not. You understood that economics wasn't a given. It was something that had evolved over a couple of centuries from Adam Smith to Ricardo, Marx, Keynes, Schumpeter, all sorts of interesting influences that didn't necessarily have a one-size-fits-all approach to understanding each economic problem. And that was the benefit of doing economics at that time. And there are still some economics courses around the world that do that, but very few, fewer and fewer by the year, because the journals are controlled by the citadel, if we could call it that, who really call the shots in terms of who gets in and who doesn't into the journals and is able to put their case for whatever it happens to be, which is usually now how many angels do you fit on the head of a pin using massive econometric modeling, but to solve relatively trivial problems. So no doubt if we had an orthodox economist in the audience here, we could have a good debate about that, and I don't mind having such debates. But what I do mind is the fact that that diversity has disappeared and those debates very rarely occur. If you're going to put a problem to the Productivity Commission, you can write the report before it appears. You know what's going to come out. In the Hawke-Keating period, we had several agencies that provided a diversity of advice, Economic Planning Advisory Council, the Bureau of Industry Economics, the Bureau of Labour Economics, the Australian Manufacturing Council that had existed for, 50 years or so, all of which were abolished or absorbed into what was then the Industry Commission, which became the Productivity Commission. And it had been successful in its main task as the tariff board in regulating tariffs up to that point and then removing them. But now it was to be the authoritative voice of the academy in government and would populate all of the government departments, mainly Treasury, of course, which is now charged with running in industrial policy, the Future Made in Australia policy. And so maybe we can talk about the effect on that, but what it has meant in the short term is that we have very narrow sources of economic advice in this country, and that is largely driven now by the academy in the universities.
I'd also add to that economics has been pumped by business, like commerce degrees. Like, people don't do straight economics anymore. It's really hard to do a straight economics degree. But anyway, hey Tim, do you want to, over to you?
Yeah, so I've got a question that kind of follows on from that. I think some of the younger academics on this caller that might be watching the tape would be astonished by your story of strolling into Newcastle and having the head of school say, "Oh, by the way, there's a senior lecturer job available," because it's considerably harder now to get that first role. And I think the difficulty of getting roles, one of my observations is that it's channeling people into publishing earlier, focusing only on publishing, focusing only on getting into the highest ranked journal possible. And it's making people be more uniform. It actually makes it harder to be interesting. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating about your career path is that it's been consistently interesting all the way through. And so I wonder if you've got some tips for people about how to maintain that interestingness while also trying to operate within the system that we have in existence today.
Yeah, that's really hard because you don't want to give advice to an early career academic, which is going to count against them for promotion, because we know promotions are largely based on publications, and publications are based on the quality of the journals that you can access, and the journals that you can access are controlled by the thought police in each case. Now, that is applicable in almost every discipline, not just economics. The disciplines have necessarily, because of these journals, become narrower and narrower. And so academics are forced along a particular path unless the university that they're in deliberately enables promotion panels to take other factors into account. Certainly teaching and learning, that's an obvious one, but also engagement and wider interdisciplinary activity. There are very few journals that cater for interdisciplinary research, as you would know. They are, that's because they have got narrower and narrower. But if you've got a university that says to you, actually, we're more interested in your impact on the world than whether you've got an extra couple of articles in a top-tier journal, that's important. And I think, without blowing the trumpet of UTS too much, I think UTS is a university that does take those things into account and still gets good rankings for its research. But where can people do that kind of interdisciplinary work unless it's deliberately programmed into the university by the senior leadership? That's something which is more the case in the Anglo-Saxon world than it is elsewhere. If you're in a German university, for example, or a German business school, they care less about the rankings than whether you're doing something useful. That's an extraordinary thing to reveal about a university, that they actually want their graduates to do something useful, and in particular in the German case in manufacturing, and connecting with industry through the Fraunhofer Institutes. And so you don't see very many business schools in Germany that are accredited to the major international accrediting bodies like AACSB, and you don't see them at the top of the rankings with some of the other major business schools because they're really focused on getting people out into society. It's not always the case, but I think it is a big distinction between us in the Anglo-Saxon world and some other countries which we pay less attention to.
Okay, Danielle.
I just wanted to echo Tim's sentiment there too, Roy, to say thank you for modelling an academic career that is truly based on contribution. And I certainly hope that we are making a shift as we get hammered in the press in Australia back to being more focused on that. You're one of the few economists that I've spoken to also about values that are based in economic models. And one of the things I've always been interested in and that we've discussed at different times is the diffusion of innovations and these organizing models, say for manufacturing in different places around the world. So the Mittelstand model in Germany and Austria, where you have these manufacturing firms that are based on the outskirts of cities. They invest deeply in high-tech R&D. They're in global supply chains, but they're also anchor firms in communities as well. They have a long-term vision and time horizon that they work to. They're the main employer, but they take that responsibility quite seriously as well. What's your sense of, why don't we have perhaps more of these types of ways of organising in Australia at the moment? You mentioned that we had these types of elaborate manufacturing firms in the late 90s. Is it a values problem or is it a management capability problem? What's happening there with this diffusion of, say, a Mittelstand model here?
Well, I think firstly, the orthodox economics approach, neoclassical economics, doesn't take into account research and technological development in the equilibrium modelling. It's a residual, so it's of zero interest. And so every time the industry department wants to put together a program to boost research and innovation, it has to remake the entire case for research and technology because it isn't going to be solved, as the Treasury might think, by simply macroeconomic lever pulling. Now, the current Treasurer, by the way, Jim Chalmers, doesn't believe that, and he'd like to see some changes. But nevertheless, the overwhelming weight of opinion within Treasury makes that very difficult for him. The thing is, other countries have understood institutional economics. The recent Nobel Prize winner, Darren Acemoglu, last year's Nobel Prize winner, wrote that book, Why Nations Fail. And it's not because the right macroeconomic levers weren't pulled, it's because the institutions weren't robust. The institutions weren't flexible. The institutions didn't use whatever means they had to intervene in the economy, to modify markets and to promote growth and social goals and environmental goals. And that's the challenge that we face in Australia, where, as we know, we're 102 in the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity, which measures the diversity and research intensity of our export mix. And we have a review going on as we speak of R&D, because R&D is now down to 1.68% of GDP, well below the OECD average. And it's not an accident that this coincides also with the collapse of manufacturing, together with our complexity, because manufacturing is the major source of business R&D in the rest of the world. So what other countries have done is not all that complicated. They've had coordinating agencies that promote research and innovation, like Innovate UK and Vinnova in Sweden and TNO in Holland, and various similar institutions in Korea and Israel and other places. And they've combined that with government procurement policies that promote local firms, with skills and education programs. And most particularly with the growth of place-based innovation ecosystems. Here in Australia, the usual start to any conversation about what the problem is that, yeah, we do great research, but we don't commercialize it. Oh, in that case, what we need are technology transfer units in universities to pluck some good ideas out of the university and put them on a linear path to the market. But this is such a small proportion of how research and innovation works in any country. It's almost laughable to see this keep on re-emerging. And so with this research and development review, what I think might occur and what I hope will occur is that they, and the recent discussion paper there takes this to some extent into account, that they will look very closely at how the Fraunhofer system works, how many of its principles have been applied now in the catapult network, the high value manufacturing catapults in the UK, which have transformed large sections of British manufacturing industry after it falling into the doldrums at the end of the 1990s, and how in the US as well, this theme has been picked up with the Manufacturing USA Institutes, with the national labs, with the National Science Foundation regional innovation engines, with the microelectronics commons. There are all sorts of interesting innovative policies that other countries are exploring and delivering that have never been contemplated here. And instead we have lots of small programs essentially all duplicating each other, getting replaced by new ministers. We have 150 budget line items for research and innovation at the Commonwealth level over 14 government departments. And indeed, we did, one of my colleagues and I did a paper a couple of years ago on how many business improvement programs there are in Australia. There are 712. So how business finds its way through that is anyone's guess. And just requires, I think, Commonwealth and state governments to get an overall grip on what we're spending and where, because in fact, we may not need to spend much more than we're spending. It may just be a matter of organising the expenditure a lot better than we do.
So Beth, back to you.
Yeah, just following on from that, you did make a comment about the Future Made in Australia policy, and the current government, federal government anyway, has a number of other big industry policies like the National Reconstruction Fund. There's the there's a few other big funds that have got a few $100 million in it. How, are they suitable for purpose? Are they fit for purpose? Are they heading in the direction that you would like to see them? Or how would you redesign them if you had a choice?
Yeah, well, it's just taken this government a long time to set them up, but they are set up now, and it's not a bad framework to be working with. It will require much more coordination. There's no coordinating agency there, but there's plenty of money in the system. There's 22.7 billion for Future Made in Australia. There's 15 billion for equity and loans through the National Reconstruction Fund. A few more billion for Rewiring Australia, for powering the regions, for the capacity investment scheme, a lot of these programs associated with energy transition, and the Australian Economic Accelerator. So you actually see a pipeline now from research through to translation, through to commercial applications and connections with industry, and then scaling, and then going into global markets. So a lot of the components of an industry policy are now in place. Just requires more coherence and a system, as I said earlier, of place-based innovation ecosystems where we have facilities that bring together industry, knowledge-based foreign direct investors, researchers in universities, CSIRO, CRCs, in specialised operations in different parts of Australia, also offering core capabilities to growing SMEs as well, and to ensure that they get scale. Once we have something like that in place, together with a coordinating agency, we then have an industry policy. But it's taking a long time to get there because it has to cross a lot of hurdles in government, especially the resistance of the economists who think that any kind of intervention is going to be suboptimal, and in particular in Treasury and the Productivity Commission. But we'll see what happens after the election. Whichever government we have, I think we'll notice that the zeitgeist globally has changed, and that most countries are now fully committed to some kind of industrial policy. And if you don't, you'll get run over in the rush.
Tim, to you, Tim, but I would like to know how you think Trump tariffs and innovation policy are going to influence the US and the war. But Tim, I'm rushing in, you go.
Well, I think, Julie, that's actually a more interesting question that follows pretty directly from what we were just talking about.
Yeah. So what do you want to, have you got thoughts on this, Roy?
Oh, I'd be interested to hear Tim's thoughts before go on.
Well, I was hearing you talk about Ireland, thinking that my country of birth is a much less interesting or shining example of innovation policy at the moment, I think. But I mean, so I guess from my perspective, there's a couple interesting things going on with all this. One is that if everything continues as it has over the last month, and if policies change in the direction that's been signaled, we're actually looking at a pretty big change in the way that the global economy is structured and the way that it works. It's natural to look at that and say that's scary, because I think it is, but also in times of flux, opportunities arise. And so I'm curious about, just what you think some of those opportunities might be, and are there things that countries or regions or ecosystems, the way that you put it, what should the really smart, forward-thinking ecosystems be thinking about right now in terms of innovation?
Yeah. Well, we're certainly in difficulty with the US policy right now. US is our main strategic partner, but our main economic partner is China.
Yep.
And we put all our eggs in that basket in terms of our resource exports. So the policy question now is not just about the destination of our exports, but our whole industrial structure that needs to move from such a reliance on resources to more complex knowledge-based activities that will require a boost from innovation policy to create. They won't happen by themselves. And that's the lesson of Ireland and Singapore and all of these other places, that you need a government that can promote it. And will the Future Made in Australia arrangements be adequate for that task? That remains to be seen, but certainly they need to step up from where they are. National Reconstruction Fund, for example, has only invested in a handful of companies so far. And one of the reasons for that is because its investment mandate is so risk averse. There's such a fear of failure, both by our investors, but also by government, that they won't take those risks that can result in failure. There's nothing wrong with failure as long as you're ahead of the game with the ones that succeed. And certainly that's the lesson of innovation agencies around the world. As far as dealing with Trump tariffs and so on are concerned, the main impact of those will no doubt come via China, because if China slows down, then they take less of our resource exports. So that's the short term. In the long term, and actually in the short term as well, do we have any leverage with the US? Well, the only leverage we seem to exercise is handing them over hundreds of millions of dollars to help them rebuild their shipyards. I don't think Trump respects weakness and servitude. I think we just have to be a lot tougher. We have to say there are some conditions around this AUKUS stuff before we proceed with it. We can certainly exercise a bit of muscle together with other trading partners. We should be getting together with Canada in particular.
Danielle, do you want to ask the last question before we head off to the audience?
I will. I was going to ask about place-based investment, but I think we've covered a bit of that. So I'm going to steal a question that Julie mentioned in our prep around the startup sector as well. I think many of us, if you're working in innovation space in the universities as academic, you often have to teach into entrepreneurship and innovation. And I think in the past decade, and UTS, I think, has led on this under your leadership, Roy, has led in also formalizing that entrepreneurship space, the startup sector. I think that formalization and that structuring has been really useful for increasing access into that space for everyone from all different types of disciplines and backgrounds. But I mean, some of the reports coming out of the sector here in Australia is that we're seeing growth in VC investment, but we're not seeing the growth, say, that inclusivity in the sector. We're seeing only 4% of VC investment going to women-owned firms. That dropped to 3% apparently the past year. What are some of the positive either policy settings that you've seen around or you'd suggest for this startup sector if it's going to be such an important part of innovation policy settings for the nation that could contribute to making it not only the growth but the inclusivity angle as well?
Yeah, I might turn that question back to you in a minute, but I think the main thing is the development of innovation precincts where we can get concentrations of activity. I think the examples around the world like Kendall Square at MIT, of Cambridge, Munich, places where they've concentrated digital or medical technologies. It links in again with the need for these place-based innovation ecosystems because they're not just about scaling, they're also about growing firms from nothing. And because you get a lot of interaction, you don't just have this linear lab to market approach, you have multiple interactions among large firms, small firms, and startups that you then start to attract capital, both domestically and venture capital from overseas in these places. So when I say we need these innovation ecosystems, that includes the startup sector, where the startup sector can be part of that pipeline from ideas through to products and into global markets and value chains. And so, Danielle, what were you thinking when you asked the question?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me that there's a similar story in many different countries around the place. But what has been a focus is on that shift from trying to not say you need to, fix women, but fix this system as well. But I think it relates to some of the hundreds of different little micro support programs around different levels of government. I think it's a similar thing for the investing in women's space as well. There's a disconnect. There's many programs, but there's often a disconnect between them all. So you can't get that flow on and that continued support for funding to get the scale ups that we perhaps need to then go on to list and so on. And so the cycle returns as well. So I think there's a similar story there in the disconnects and the plethora of programs and also the disconnect as well, and not taking a systemic approach would be my experience.
No, exactly.
Okay, so we've only got 7 minutes left. Do any of our panelists have any more burning questions?
I was going to ask Beth the question that she asked me about Future Made in Australia. What do you see as the prospect at the moment with that set of programs?
So I see some of our export sectors, particularly in the resources sector, as being very vulnerable to the climate change agenda, because a lot of them are very high carbon emitting industries, and like, you know, iron ore, coal, gas, they're all aluminium, bauxite, they're all our biggest exports. Without them, our exchange rate will plummet and we'll get into a downward spiral. If we're serious about the transition to a low carbon economy, we have got to look at developing and making efficient new technologies to produce, and iron ore is the classic one, produce iron in a way that is low carbon, does not emit as much carbon dioxide. And that's not about energy use, that's about the chemical reaction they use to take the oxygen off the iron oxide. That requires a lot of work, and not only R&D work, but work with basic manufacturing industry. So that, I think that's really, really critical. And you keep thinking, oh, you know, it's just a whole pack of rich miners out in the Pilbara, but actually it really affects us all. So I think that's something we've really got to take seriously. Future Made in Australia is really fixated on that, so I'm really pleased about that, but it just gets bashed up a lot because it's not everything that everyone wants. Sure, it's not, but it's really, really important. I also buy heavily into that precinct argument because we do a lot of work with really big databases. They're all geo-coded. They're 100%, you know, we've got a census of firms. We can see how they've changed over 20 years. We can see people moving between firms. We know people movement and physical proximity matter. So, you know, I just would agree with what discussion Danielle and Tim and you have had about precincts and geographic location. But also I know that for the last couple of decades, governments have been talking about precincts and doing things, but it sort of hasn't moved the dial. So yes, we need to do more things. So that's a long-winded, I don't think we've got more time to go into it, but yes, I can, two big burning issues in the industrial space, I see. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a question here from Andrew Roberts Cummings. Andrew, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, and certainly you've been talking about, hello, and I'm Andrew Cummings. I'm part of GlobalX and been part of this in conversation series with Rajesh for some time. I'm very happy to be here and hear about your work. Very impressive. So I've been working on territorial innovation systems in Central America and looking how innovation capabilities emerge and seeing from the policy side what science, technology, innovation policies, or just innovation policies actually can support this in small scale rural agri-industries, for example. And so you talked a lot about place-based policies. I don't know if you want to add more on specifically your, you know, in a local governance a structure outside the metropolitan area. What do you need to think about as innovation policy people, and maybe how do you relate to some of your, you know, your firms and your universities, and how much is endogenous and how much is really building connections and building capabilities to do networking, because you don't need everything there and you need to connect outside, which is, I think, also many times neglected. You think everything should be there. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a really good question and great points. Well, I think what Dan Bresnitz thinks in his book, Innovation in Real Places, he got very exercised by the fact, and this was a trend a little while ago, that everywhere wanted to be like Silicon Valley. And you had these rural locations and completely unrealistic expectations in various places around the world. Yes, we've got to bring in all these big digital companies, otherwise we won't amount to anything. But what Dan says in his book is there is only one Silicon Valley. No one else is going to be that. You've got to be the best that you can be. You have to go through a process, whether it's a rural location, regional, outer metropolitan, you, together with the regional stakeholders, determine what are the areas of current and potential competitive advantage of your region or your geographical area, and then you double down on those together with local firms and universities. And in particular, if you have universities and vocational training centres in those areas, then that helps you focus on what you want to be and how you can make the connections, as you say, which are essential to success. And we see some very good examples of that around the world. There was one really interesting study by Ben Armstrong of MIT who compared the trajectory of Pittsburgh with Cleveland, two relatively regional locations, quite large towns, of course, but Pittsburgh transformed from a deindustrialized steel town, and Cleveland struggled. And there were all sorts of reasons for that. And one of them was about how the universities played the role in each of those areas and how they built connections. So it's a very pertinent point.
Okay, and our final question for the night is from Mola Tedesi Leque. Are you there, Mola?
Hello.
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 Hi.
Yes. Yes, I am Ulla Tadesse from Ethiopia. Thanks so much, Professor Roy, for your very insightful conversation. And thank you, Rajesh, and for your hosting of this very important program, which is very important lesson for all of us. My question on here is that how much the contribution of social capital in the diffusion of innovation in Australia innovation system is my first question, and better if I can listen from him comparing of the social capital system and the digital platform in diffusion of innovation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, social capital isn't something we've considered except obliquely up till now, but it is critical to success. If you have a town where, or a region where no one connects with each other, maybe it's a commuter belt, you're never going to build up critical mass. But if you're in a town, and the one I know well is Newcastle, with a high degree of community commitment, focus, and, if you like, social capital, it provides the basis for developing a thriving research and innovation ecosystem, especially when all the different stakeholders are playing into it in a consistent way. Of course, there are arguments, of course, people have their own interests, but as long as there is a focus for dialogue and then action that follows from that, social capital can be a great contributor to success.
Okay, and at 10:32, I think we are now complete. I'd like to thank our participants, to Beth, to Tim, to Danielle, thank you very much. And in particular, I'd like to thank Roy Green, round of applause, and thank you, Rajesh. It's been a very interesting discussion.
And thank you, Julie, for hosting us like that. Fantastic.
Delighted.
Thanks, Tim, Danielle, Beth.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.